Hello all, and now continuing with Michel Foucault, I wanted to weave in his History of Sexuality, and now if you hadn't watched the videos I did on him before, I had mentioned that an interesting way, or at least a helpful way, to look at Foucault and what he's really getting at in his philosophical career, or just along his life really, is to see three distinct, separate projects or themes. And History of Sexuality really is now that the theme of ethics and what he thinks about these concepts such as freedom and of course sexuality, as we'll get into. And so it could be interesting to put a couple things in your head here before we really get going. Foucault, obviously, in Discipline and Punish, is going to be highly influential political activistic movements such as prison reform, and really just stands, of course, in a sort of canon of skepticism towards psychoanalytic methodologies. And so he's obviously very influential in that, and that continues here with the History of Sexuality. These really, famous quotes such as, the abolition of man, and of course, always being in power. Like any discussion about power is always in power. And of course that, sends a black pill up a lot of people's spines. But, let's consider, of course, where he's positioned with regards to Friedrich Nietzsche, and, trying to take up in spades really the idea of going beyond, good and evil, and that sort of binary of really concealed wills of how our values are constructed. And so seeing his relationship with Nietzsche, or as a sort of student of Nietzsche, is of course important, and something to consider when we're going to look at his ethics and really what Foucault is trying to tell us, or even write to us about. There's this kind of idea that Foucault just because he thinks a lot of our social constructions are just arbitrary, that this just totally lends completely to nihilism, although I do think in a lot of regards that this is a very or at least lends itself to very nihilistic mindsets. I don't think that, and certainly this was true with Foucault, an intellectual rigorness towards something like the construction of values, or a history of ideas. These ideas are going to play into who you are as a person, how you live ethically. What's the idea of the good life, if there even is one? Is it just arbitrarily constructed? If that's the case, then why bother, quite literally. And so I want to fend you away from that with Foucault here, because obviously he's doing this ultimately to say that our social constructions, if they are arbitrary, then we can free ourselves or liberate ourselves in the notions of something like human freedom, away from such categories, away from such presuppositions, or at least evaluate them in a different way. And so Foucault himself, he really didn't like that consideration of being ultimately just a post-structuralist, because one of his methods with regards to archaeology in his prior text we went over is really a sort of structuralism. You have to dig deep to really get at these structures. And so the post-structure, which we'll see in this text, is of course one of genealogy, which you're taking discourses and what's discursive in these relations between institutions and ultimately how it forms our subjectivity even. And so you're going to need to, look at the surface in some aspect, even if it is just on, a surface level. This is just one method of understanding, power. So constructs like madness or criminality, Foucault is going to, go to the end extreme with all of these to, limit or even, abolish notions of nature or, as we've said, man before. But, in saying that, I want to weave this all into the end of the video and display some of the shortfalls that, comes with these ideas. But now, that's out of the way, I want to now look at the history of sexuality. So Foucault and the history of sex is, as we've said, a genealogy of these different power relations that are ultimately outside of a single authoritarian or even a single author or writer. This extends also to something like an institution. And so in this sense, one power center can also come from below or, in the monarch metaphor, from the crown down. But there is control from below. And so this, of course, is departing from, traditional understandings from, those ideas of molar aggregates or arborescent models, if you will, as you apply these to multiple disciplines here. And so he's getting us away from that sovereign or law from the top down understanding that we are so accustomed to since really the Enlightenment. And so the history of sex is based on these discourses that produce what we think of sexuality. Discourses, to be more specific, such as medical, the priestly, and the confessional, and ultimately conversations or discussions, conversations, if you will, on sex and what makes our epistemology and thus power in this relationship. In other words, it's a desire to really know and understand sexuality and thus understanding the relations to power and discourse and how these topics are even formed. For Foucault, and this is really getting into one of the themes he takes most umbrage with is the idea of repression. And so the discourse of repression really goes back to the Victorian era and really within even the idea of repression, liberation is also on the scene, really, since we assume repression in this discourse. We must, liberate ourselves. And so this really comes into two different dimensions of how we consider power here. There's the positive and the negative. The negative is of course, that top-down deferral, if you will, from the hierarchical standings, the sovereign, coming down onto you. But this is contrary to that productive power. With the productive power, how can we know in this discourse that we actually are repressed? There's no, empirical method here to actually prove such a claim. And so this, sexual discourse then was really relegated to, very specific disciplines and technicians and specific places even, such as, the confession between the priest and the confessor, or the Freudian psychoanalytic confession, where, you really unload your sort of behaviorisms to someone to distinguish, below a surface understanding and make sense of it. In other words, a rationality or the Enlightenment period, the episteme, if you will, leads to discourses of medicine and ultimately a positivistic incitement to how discourse goes about. Insight to discourse is one of those Foucauldian terms that you'll run into. But really, in essence, he is saying we discourse about the not talking of sex itself. And so it is overall discursive in the way sex itself is put in discourse by institutional preferences. And so, again, with the repressive hypothesis, this is determinant of institutions who allow who to speak of and in what way on sexual discourses. Sex is interested in the power relation of how sex is presented, and thus, laying claim to power or a hegemony, if you will, when such a discourse presupposed really that there is a middle class or someone well connected enough to even enter into something like psychiatric help, to even have or seek out therapy, and take part in that discourse, presupposed such people to begin with, or the bourgeois middle class, if you will. And this, of course, extends with the Christian confessional. We detail our sins to be abolished and freed from, or at least forgiven. And of course, this is a creation and censoring of taboos. And so Foucault is really saying that there is a relationship of who is accounting for sex and who is ultimately consuming that account. And so sex in a subjective way, such as the priest to worshiper or the therapist to the client. And so Christianity shifts us from this sort of sexual Victorian judgment to now, in the Enlightenment episteme, of a more scientific, rational, and ultimately usage of sex for functionality. Birthing rates and discourse certainly comes to mind here. And so this usage, such as populations or the controlling of populations, it is really demonstrated with such things as what is life expectancy, and this really leads into one of his classical and most notable ideas with biopower. And so what can, he's asking, what can sex be used for under this change here from, the Christian way sexuality was discoursed about to now one of, functionality, one of, what is the use, and how can we, magnify this in a biopolitical sense for the controlling of, populations or decision making. And so, now I want to shift, perhaps, as he does, to the psychoanalysis within Freud, or at least his tradition. Repression, such laws and morals, such as there's these Freudian cases that in today's standards and in today's legality. You probably wouldn't even be able to, publish such a thing, right? Especially with regards to, underaged, sexuality, and, these categories themselves that, we have today didn't exist in that, time period that Freud is accounting for a lot of his clients. And, the point is, of course, with Foucault is that, discourses and how they, frame us, has a genealogy to such acts such as, pedophilia. This, I think, is really about the simple man for Freud in that discussion, if you know that case very well. And so Foucault is saying that, we have a multiplicity of discourses which are, paramount to an underlying complex network of different relationships between these institutions, creating how we feel about these subjects, or subjectivity even. Medicine alone isn't going to create the belief of repression. So power operates through a more capillary, or as I like to always refer to it in the Deleuzian sense, the rhizomatic way of considering, how events, or this discursive way in how it shapes power. An appropriate way would, by the way, there's a addendum that kind of bothered me about the last video. Since I weaved governmentality really into discipline and punish, I kind of misspoke and insinuated that governmentality had actually came out before, the first volume for sure of A History of Sexuality, and of course that's not the case. Governmentality actually wasn't put together and published until far after Foucault had already passed, and so I just wanted to put that aside in here. But nonetheless, I wanted to make a distinction between, how in governmentality, power, or the law, the sovereign law that's, written in sort of deferral sense, really overlays here to, how medical institutions and their evaluation of a client towards something like madness as a sort of negative power. And then, of course, you have the positive power, which, produces knowledge or epistemology, and, never ends this sort of discourse about something like sexuality or the taboos and ills within a certain discipline or practice, and what's allowed to let live, if you will, and allowed to not, which we'll get into later. And so productivity within these new classifications of, what is perversion is the production of the further discourse and understanding itself. This is a pleasurable to the distinction of, sexual pleasures, and this consistency, this overarching, want to have a sort of greater and grander understanding, and the polarity with that with sexual pleasures actually creates a sort of spiral that he paints for us, this perpetual spiral between pleasure and power, because they're actually both weaved into each other. Understanding is a sort of pleasure, and of course, power also plays into pleasure. And now I want to shift into what he has to say to, scientism, or how science introduces in the searching of factualities. And so truth, of course, is treated as if it's, separate or ahistorical, or even apart from, political influence or its institutions. Science is always seen as, away from historicism. The positivist assumption is that we can, discern truth, which requires an equal footing, though, within science that Foucault would warn. There has to be disciplines that ultimately undermine other disciplines that are really gated within this idea of being the true science. And this really echoes with how this decade has really turned out, if you pay attention to a lot of the sayings of representing the true and real science, and also who's gated out of such discourses by assumptions of something like credentials. I think that really reigns true within the themes here. So ultimately, you require a disciplinary rigorness, if you will, or alternative academic approach to these practices in order to even have any leeway in something discursive. Foucault would ask, what is this science for, and why is it legitimized as such, and what is the purpose of such a science? By declaring oneself a science, we are making the assumption that science is this full maturation of what's the real epistemology or truth in a given claim. And, like I said, only disputing this requires, other sciences to root out something like bad science. And so it's sort of self-contained within this gated notion of science. And so Foucault actually says he's the anti-science, or at least the genealogy is an anti-science. Scientia, offers up different ways how the West really has produced knowledge, such as truth or false claims, and so how we do sexuality or produce it is constructed as such. And so the West, he says, is positioned again to that confessional understanding of sexual discourse. Something like the child to the parent, or policing, admitting details to the doctor or the teacher, confessing sins or misgressions. We even, do this sort of online confessional. We see this all the time on, these social media apps of people just confessing they're spilling their life to you at a whim, and even monetizing it. It's kind of gross in that sort of sense. Or even, of course, the priestly distinction. And so we have this, self-discipline itself, to even confess to one self about, a hidden truth. This, of course, is something to consider with, understandings of subconsciousness and how that plays into the consciousness. But this is ultimately a production of the Western subjectivity of the speaker and listener. This is the power dynamic between the two in a confessional way. And so science uses the subjectivity then for Foucault to collect about a discourse or a scientific discursivity. Discursivity really being a discourse that ultimately gets put into actual practical concreteness. And so the doctor pair what patients account for and correlate to symptoms and translate into medical jargon or medical language which creates a discourse. The second is this sort of causal search for any sexual dysfunction or underlying causality, such as the case, of course, with Freud, who traces his interpretation, as Deleuze would critique with and Guattari, to the Oedipal structures. There must be something with your mother or father, the hypothesis of some sort of sexual repression. Third is the principle of latency, which again is a Freudian term of that underlying cause of symptoms, such as dreams having a latent content which drives what we actually see in our dreams. Something must be explained about sexuality that is hidden, and Freud's going to show us the hiddenness of what is actually underlying how we're seeing our sort of lived horizons, if you will. Where fourth is a confession turned into a continuity, or the tracing of latent mechanisms hidden from the person producing such, psychoanalysis, who ultimately has the technical credentials and is trained to really trace these borders, if you will. And then you have, of course, the medical effects of confession. The believing of confession, or therapeutics, if you will, is ultimately, putting feelings into words, which is a cure in the act of speaking, which becomes a sort of therapy, of course. And in that sort of pernicious way, as I've actually discussed somewhat in past videos, the problem and the cure actually are, contained within it in that sort of sense. If, just confessing and, sharing feelings is, part of the cure, then, you're always going to, need that sort of medical effect, that's sort of therapeutic, and it in itself becomes problematized. And so, shifting gears here, Foucault, of course, famously says in the metaphor of cutting the head off the king is necessary in a theory of power, which is essentially the critique of sovereign power, or at least its structure, being the only authoritative one-size-fits-all scheme of power in an analysis. He wants to, of course, open that up. And so we could think of the networking again in the capillary blood vessel sense of a sort of decentralized or rhizomatic structure, as opposed to the arborescent model or the face of the state to just kill. Laws and codes aren't the starting point in power analysis. Or, again, law and its construction is for Foucault the negative power or the top-down sovereign power, or another Foucauldian term, if you will, is the juridical power, which is a synthesis of the jury and the judges, which kind of goes back to discipline and punish, if you will. And the discursive or discourses put into practice in that sense. Monarchies or centralized power is ultimately idealized or used as a simplification, and so this use of the monarch for a metaphor of the power that works top down, this misses the operation of the capillary or instruments of power and what internalizes the disciplines of a bodied people. And so the monarch uses force and violence to control populations with, of course, the divine right or the divine mandate to ultimately give the right to death, which, of course, is a big theme for Foucault. And so Foucault then is going to actually lend us to that, in a historical sense, the sovereign big man, the likes of come to mind with Stalin and communism, or Hitler and fascism. There's no historical subject or big man that is sufficiently enough in describing their actual power, for there was mechanisms prior and below him that existed to exhibit that position of the big man to begin with. And so the mechanisms and power relations, or as Foucault put, technologies of powers, is a comprehensive system of power, as opposed to, again, that one size fits all notion. And so Foucault then shifts to one of the resistance concept. And so wherever power is going to rest, there is resistance, and any resistance, of course, is varied, and as such, any power has a plurality to it as well. The idea of Marxism as resistance, it of course isn't unified, just as Foucault in his writings in postmodernity and poststructuralism, as we'll get into with Baudrillard, of course, isn't unified either. And so the resistance of middle-class bourgeoisism, of course, has come with many different forms of Marxism and post-Marxism. Again, resistance has a sort of plurality as well as power does. Power then many times is actually localized and comes from below. Now Foucault wants to suggest that we need different and ultimately no unified strategies in the modeling of power, but there are 4 variations that he talks about of such strategies. 1 is the sexualization of children. 2 is female hysteria. 3 is the category of perverts and perversion. And 4 is new laws or regulations designed to control populations, or BioPolitics, as we'll get into. For Foucault, these modes of power production molds and weaves our understanding of the discursive construct we call sexuality. And so despite the appearance of a unified way of how all of these things somehow come together and appear to us, such as the static representation of power, or the static way laws are assembled through public opinion. As such, it's actually these different modes of production that ultimately make up just this unified way that we see our relationships really with power. And so to perhaps recap here for you guys, the juridical discursive theory of the metaphor of power as the sovereign monarch, or centralized power as sovereign power that places limits and has the right to live and die. This form of power is that at least Foucault is saying that contrasts this is much more subtle than our previous understanding, than just letting live and what is let lived. This is only one technology of a multiplicity of power and its fostering of life or disallowing to death. So this new power synthesizes these two poles of or disciplined desire. A will to know, with this biopower, is the power over life. And so to go through these poles here, the disciplined power in the first pole is trained on the lived body for particulars or useful ends, such as with discipline and punish. Bodies are rendered as docile bodies for Foucault. And so this power is, of course, individuality and a discourse about the production of individuals and their bodily autonomy. And so the second pole is biopolitics, with the production of regulations on populations. Or in other words, any discourse that produces concepts like a population. We can send in these different technocrats to investigate novelties, if you will, or investigate our norms, and then we have someone who comes along and takes this research and then produces statistical aggregates out of that, which then gets shared on social media, if you will, and then forms public opinion, which then recursively weaves into law and the sort of governmentality understanding that institutions will then use to pass laws and create mandates in our democratic way of understanding law and society, quite literally. And so biopowers functions in its normalization rather than the sovereign, brutish way power used to control populations. Foucault says the official and unofficial discourses of public opinion on a moral imperative, which is enforced, of course, through something like peer pressure or cultural norms. And then, of course, that goes in with the technician who reinforces or creates that new statistical elaboration of such a moral imperative, which creates reactions, and then you have, next thing you know, you have a new mandate for a new law. But Foucault, and why he ultimately chose sex and sexuality, has a particularness in its positioning, because of course it really lends itself to being susceptible to not just the disciplinary, stoic, if you will, individual way that power is done over one single lived body in its individual decision making. Again, birth rates or even something like birth control come to mind here, and how that plays into the biopolitical, where regulating populations both actually covers the decision making that the individual makes and the discourses about individual choice creation, as well as the controlling of greater populations in biopolitics. So again, think birth control with population control, and birth control with the individual. And so that really gets at what Foucault really thinks in regards to ethics, in regards to nature even. One of the interesting things to perhaps consider with these subcultures that Foucault himself, of course, in any discussion about Foucault, we obviously have to bring up the fact that he quite literally, lived out his philosophy, as gruesome as it is. Of course, Foucault was into the sadistic subcultures. Is this just an intellectual undermining of some, aggregate or cultural norm, if you will? Or is this actually his desire? Is it again that sort of spiral analogy here? Is it power and its understanding, or is it actually the real pleasure itself? So something again like homosexuality with Foucault, of course, he cares greatly about this sort of linguistic category or concept didn't really begin until the 19th century. Delineates away from something like the sins of the flesh, is ultimately that sort of reading of Nietzsche to bring us back here, fuel to his partaking in these subcategories that were quite popular and in many regards even more popular today. Nature, quite literally, or at least these categories, are constructed by BioPolitics, and getting outside and provoking this sort of outsideness and free flowed desire against the codified state and morality actually tends to, if we're going to sort of critique here, superficial and nebulous ideas of what define the outsider and his relation to the inside. In other words, Foucault, insists on these constructions, how, in many regards they're holding us back, but he still ultimately is choosing, in an arbitrary way, to, prop up a sort of, these flight paths, if you will, to bring in Deleuze here, that, goes against nature or against our social constructions. And, since he was so politically active, how do you actually legitimize such notions? But of course, there is notions, and even how Foucault traces sexuality, all the way to the most ancient of societies. Perhaps there is, something more to be said about such categories than just their social construction. And I think this also applies to moral evaluations, and how politics, in a lot of sense, is actually creating codes or limitations on desire. Of course, that's how he sees sovereign power, as a deferral from the top down. How does Foucault escape from this sort of nihilism, if you will, where someone needs to be protected in order to exhibit their own desire from someone else's desire. And so it comes to mind that he was for decriminalization of criminal as an entire category, and signed petitions, and was an activist in a lot of these ideas here. But again, if that's the case, then how does he overcome that? His own idea of freedom is, of course, not just another arbitrary notion, or these subcategories that are undermining past structures, past ways of being or understanding of humanity or man. The death of man comes to mind, or the abolition of man away from the construction or social construction of our biology. Well, maybe that basis isn't just lends itself to only a social construction. We can have a discourse about the physicalism of this wall, but is that going to change the fact that there is a physical stopgap here that's going to stop me from moving forward through this thing? That of course comes to mind, and Foucault has been critiqued many times over for such notions that I've shared here. But I think that puts a bow really on Michel Foucault, and as we'll get into and we'll see with different ways that poststructuralism is going to go here, the thinker that comes to mind the most for me is actually someone who takes a lot of contention with Michel Foucault, and that is with Jean Baudrillard. And so I'll be excited to start him with you guys, and I hope you guys like, comment, and subscribe, and keep on watching, and I'll keep on producing. See you guys.